Yep, electric vehicles. They keep shoving them down our throats, and they also keep shoving them down the throats of the American military. Is that going to be good for us? Colin Anderson has been digging in on this. He's a staff writer for the Washington Free Beacon, out with a new piece this week, headlined Military Efficiency, Biden's electric vehicle push adds hours to routine Marine trip. Colin, good to talk to you today, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, this is an area that I'm familiar with. Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. I spent many years there, lived there as a Marine Corps brat. What is going on in North Carolina with these electric vehicles?
Oh, look, we're talking about a base here that is in southwest Georgia, and they're a bit ahead of the curve when it comes to this EV adoption. This is something that the Biden administration has sort of flirted with plans on for quite a while. It started way back in 2021. Biden's deputy defense secretary said that they would have plans for tactical vehicles to go hybrid and then electric, think, Humvees and things of this nature. But that in the shorter term, non-tactical cars and trucks could go electric right away. And so the space that we covered in Georgia sort of took matters into their own hands a bit and decided that they were going to adopt an electric vehicle fleet pretty early on. They're a bit ahead of the curve on this. The problem is that even when you're talking non-tactical vehicles, there are all sorts of extended trips that our servicemen and women need to make in order to carry out their day-to-day mission. And in this case, Marines from the base often travel to Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, which you mentioned. And this is a trip. It's 520 miles. It's not a short trip by any means, but you can do it on one tank of gas and a new Ford F-150 if you get the conventional engine. This base did not. They got the Ford F-150 Lightning, Ford's electric model. You cannot make this trip on one electric battery charge. In fact, you need three. What that means is that you have to stop at least twice to make this trip from one base to the next, which they make regularly. And the biggest problem with that is that there is very, very little effective public charging infrastructure. So if you're a Marine making this drive from Georgia to North Carolina, you're stopping in Walmart parking lots and gas station parking lots to charge your electric F-150 just like anyone would. And in doing so, you're taking at the very least an hour and a half per charge is what we found charting out this trip. And by the way, that's assuming that these charging stations actually work. And if you look at reviews and these sorts of community websites where folks who go and charge their EVs at these ports, they leave reviews, they tell you all the time, they hardly ever charge at full speed. There's often long lines. They usually do not work at all. And so we're talking about, at the very least, adding 3 hours both ways to what should and has always been a very routine trip from one base to another. And again, it can be an all-day affair if you have the sorts of charging issues that electric vehicle users have every day on long road trips such as this. It doesn't seem to be stopping the Biden administration from moving forward, though, with, again, all sorts of plans to adopt EVs into the military.
So the Marines have to stop on their way from Albany, Georgia to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. They have to stop twice to recharge, and this adds how many hours of time to that trip?
It adds at least 3 hours to the trip. And when we reached out to the base and asked, they actually confirmed. They said that they have not taken the electric truck on this trip yet, but they have also charted out the amount of time that it would add, as we did. And they say that it would add 3 hours of charge time, which is the same conclusion that we came to. But again, this is essentially assuming that everything goes as smoothly as possible. And the problem is, when we looked into the specific charging stations, again, these are public stations in Walmart parking lots and gas station parking lots and things of this nature. You have users of these specific charging stations that note that they almost never worked as advertised in terms of charging speeds and things of that nature. So if you read one, they say that this specific charging station that is on this route from the military base in Georgia to Camp Lejeune, one reviewer that we quote in this piece called it straight trash. Another said that it was so pathetic that it could kill EV adoption because it is that slow and difficult to charge at these stations that no one in their right mind would want to do it. And again, this is what we're expecting from our Marines trying to carry out, a logistical mission here.
Also, if I'm not mistaken, an entry-level F-150 that has an internal combustion engine is way cheaper than an F-150 Lightning. Isn't that right?
Yeah, you're certainly correct about that. It's been a big hurdle for the general public looking to adopt electric vehicles. In general, they're about $10,000 more on average. The F-150 Lightning itself, the base model where you're talking the lowest range in terms of battery life, is about $60,000. If you want to extend that range, you can run all the way up to $100,000 for this truck.
Right, and I'm not. I've heard some reviews of this truck. It's not all it's cracked up to be. There was a lot of excitement about this, the electric truck, back when they announced it. I know it's got all sorts of ports on the back of it. You can plug in all your tools and things. But I've seen some real kind of negative reviews of this truck ever since its release, and now the Marines are adopting it as a means to get troops around.
They are, and yeah, there was quite a bit of hype back in 2021 at its release. Joe Biden drove it at a Ford factory in Michigan, and he had some very serious reactions to his driving. He called it, excuse me, quote, a big boy, which was quite an interesting review. He also said that it was quick. And by all accounts, it is the 0 to 60 seems to be quite fast. It is a rather large truck, as the president described. The main problem here is, of course, battery range, and what that means getting from point A to point B. It's particularly an issue on the highway. The battery life in general for this truck, and often electric cars in general, when you're driving the highway, it does not live up to the advertised battery range, which is, of course, a big problem for road trips such as this one. But again, the plan here is that both tactical and non-tactical vehicles will at the very least become hybrid and or electric in the coming future, which is, I mean, to me, you know, and we quoted some folks in the piece that you mentioned saying as much as well. If we're talking about issues with public charging stations on, you know, American highways from Georgia to North Carolina, I'm not quite sure what the infrastructure is going to be like in, say, Afghanistan.
Non-existent is the answer to that. And so, you know, we're hamstringing the American military when we should be giving them the most efficient and safe vehicles ever in order to conduct their very lethal and needed missions.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think, you know, it's going to be very interesting to see how this develops going forward, because, you know, we've had sort of reiterations from the Biden administration really in the last number of weeks that they continue to support this effort. Jennifer Granholm, Biden's energy secretary, was asked about this in a Senate hearing just back in April, and said she supports the adoption of what she called an EV fleet. And again, the administration's made very clear that we're not just talking about the non-tactical vehicles, you know, cars and trucks stationed domestically like we're talking about today, which is plenty of an issue, but they're talking about Humvees.
You know, it's kind of weird. You know, one of the features of the military you hear a lot of, like, you know, active duty guys, veterans complain about is, like, you know, you get in the military and you're using a lot of, like, old equipment, staying in old barracks. The building hasn't been renovated in 1,000 years. You know, it smells weird. The base housing's awful. There's bugs everywhere. But the cutting edge stuff is the electric cars that don't work.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's one of those things where, you know, you see this speculation, you know, decades and decades ago of what we will achieve by 2023. And perhaps we will see flying cars and revolutions beyond our wildest imaginations. And as it turns out, it's as if much of our developments in modern technology have been to making things more energy efficient, more climate friendly, and things of this nature, as opposed to better and more functional.
Do you get the impression that the Biden administration and the left broadly on this issue has a special obsession with forcing the military into compliance on its agenda?
Well, I think often what they talk about is the idea that, you know, the federal government is this large emitter. They talk about it all the time, for example, when they put out orders to sort of clean up the carbon emission scene in federal buildings. And so it's sort of the same thing here. When you think of the military, if you're a climate-focused person, of which there are many in the Biden administration, of course, you think about not necessarily efficiency and lethality and combat readiness and things of this nature. But really what you see is a gigantic footprint, a gigantic carbon footprint. And so if that is the sole issue that you're viewing, the military and the federal government through, then of course the U.S. military is going to be a massive target in your mind, because if you're talking about carbon footprint, it's as big as it gets in the government. So I think for someone who is thinking of issues solely through a climate lens, it's impossible not to look through the military. I think obviously the argument would be that they should not be looking at the military through a climate lens.
At what point do they start assessing the carbon footprint of bullets? Do we move to electric bullets, or do we use the old ones with the gunpowder in them?
Well, it's a very good question, in the sense that there are all sorts of things that are being raised that we're not entirely sure, or certainly would not think of carbon emissions in the past, that now all of a sudden we're being warned with dire and very serious concerns.
Yeah.
That actually the sorts of things we use in the day-to-day are destroying the environment. I've read of this when it comes to tequila and mezcal, if you're into that sort of thing. I've even read this morning in the Washington Post that actually your tires are spewing pollution. And so we need to think of how to use other kinds of rubbers and things of this nature.
Yes.
To change our tires. So it's not just that you need to change your engine, you need to change your tires too. And oh, by the way, if you do change your engine, the electric vehicles are heavier, and that's going to cause more tire tread, and that kills the environment in and of itself. So I'm not really sure what isn't on the table in terms of the carbon footprint at this point.
Yeah, you got to lock yourself in your house. That's the only solution here. Colin Anderson, thank you. Or actually, the real solution is to fight for liberty. Thank you for doing that. Washington Free Beacon's Colin Anderson. Thank you, Colin.